I hope you had a great break after our first talk from Boris Gloger. Now we're immediately going to the second talk, which is Joseph Pelrine. I'm super excited to have Joseph on. He's one of the I think he's the very first European certified Scrum trainer. He will maybe introduce himself a bit more in detail throughout his presentation. Joseph is an Agile psychologist, and that's not just a term. He is actually a psychologist, and he is one of the thought-leading Agilists around the world. And I think he has some pretty good insights about combining these two fields of research and knowledge and getting some interesting insights out of that. When Joseph and I were talking a few days ago about his presentation, we discovered that we both have a love for South American literature. Now, his presentation today, Love in the Time of Corona, is an homage to Gabriel Garcia Marquez's book, Love in the Time of Cholera, and I really hope that you will all enjoy it the same way that I did when I briefly went through the presentation. Joseph, handing over to you, your stage.
Good. Thank you. We don't have that much time, and this talk isn't about me, so I'm going to just introduce myself as little as possible. On one side of my life, I've been working with Agile methods for about as long as they've been around. On the other side, I am a psychologist. I gave an early version of this talk back in April, and at that time, my focus was more on trying to figure out the situation and how to do Agile work in it. Over the past couple of months, my work has been focused on working as a psychologist, doing counseling and therapy, especially to medical personnel, to people who've been really affected by Corona and the results of it. And that's changed my point of view and my focus and my thoughts about a lot of these things. So let's start out. A number of years back, I used to work as CTO of a company named eBay, which some of you might know. And during my tenure at eBay, something happened that changed my whole thinking about agility. So can you bring the next slide up, please? A little volcano in Iceland exploded, and within 24 hours, it threw all transportation in Europe back a century. I was stranded at home in Switzerland, and I couldn't get to our office in Amsterdam to work. That wasn't bad, but I had a team stuck in Lviv in the Ukraine who couldn't get back to Amsterdam, and they spent over 24 hours on trains. I even had a friend, a pilot for Swissair, who was stranded and missed his own wedding. Things like this happen, and they got me thinking about volcanoes. Volcanoes are events that happen that have three characteristics. First, you can't predict them. You don't know when they're going to come. Second, you can't influence them. But third, you have to respond to them. In the business world, we have three different types of volcanoes. The first are our customers. You can't predict changes in fashion. That's very difficult. Can you influence them? There are very few notable exceptions who can do that. Steve Jobs might be the typical exception. But you have to respond to changes in your customers' interest. Otherwise, they'll go away, they'll leave you, they'll go to your competitors, who are the second volcano. You can't predict what your competitors are going to bring on the market. Can you influence it? Companies that aren't technically innovative anymore attempt to influence the competitors by legal means, by means of lawsuits. Take, for example, Apple versus Samsung, a $1 billion lawsuit on the shaping of mobile phones. Or take, for example, Oracle versus Google on APIs in Java. These are companies which, sorry, they're not as innovative as they used to be, who are trying to stifle their competition. Third volcano are external influences, be it laws, regulations, be it workers' councils or unions. Agility is the ability to respond quickly, effectively, and efficiently to these volcanoes. But as we've seen with the volcano that is COVID-19, agility also hits the wall. What happens when these volcanoes overwhelm our ability to react? Then we get to a next point. There's a psychological disorder which is known as adjustment disorder, which is the body and the mind's inability to react to rapid change. Its closest relative in the DSM is post-traumatic stress disorder. But adjustment disorder manifests itself in two ways, with anxiety and with depression, which may lead to changes in behavior. What I've seen in the past couple of months in my work is that these adjustment disorders, this shock, shakes the foundations of our being and makes us question a lot the basis of our existence and of our interactions. And what this gets back to in our interactions is something we call psychological safety. Now, this is a buzzword that you all have probably heard. I must say, as a psychologist, I'm really frustrated when non-psychologists start throwing around buzzwords like this without really understanding them. And in that case, I prefer to use a quote from Inigo Montoya, who says, "You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means." So before I start talking about psychological safety, I'd like to do a little poll with you. There should be a poll up saying that on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 where it's totally uncomfortable and 5 totally uncomfortable, can you rate how comfortable you feel discussing interpersonal issues with your colleagues at work? Okay. 1 would be I'm totally uncomfortable with it. 2, somewhat uncomfortable. 3, I'm neutral. 4, I'm somewhat comfortable. And 5, I'm totally comfortable. Could you please fill out that poll?
And remember, those polls are in the polls section, and it's the third poll from the top. We will also have 2 other polls coming in from Joseph. So Joseph, do you want me to give you preliminary results on the poll?
Yes, please. I can't see them.
Yeah, so we have 26% saying totally comfortable, 5, 34% saying somewhat comfortable, 26% saying neutral, 11% somewhat uncomfortable, and only 3% so far saying, fortunately, totally uncomfortable.
Okay. This is a very interesting audience then, which is very happy for me to know. Let's go on to the second poll then. On a scale from 1 to 5, how much has your view of this changed since January? Have you gotten more comfortable discussing these things, or have you gotten less comfortable? Second poll.
Exactly, the second poll from the top. And here we already have some preliminary results. 13% is 5, totally better. 29%, somewhat better. 39% neutral. 19% somewhat worse. And so far, 0% totally worse.
Okay. What this goes to prove is that sometimes you shouldn't use a 5-point scale, because if you do, most people end up putting neutral in. Okay. But it's interesting that for some types of conversations, you do feel more comfortable when you're separated and you're in a virtual environment. This is something we'll get to a bit later. Okay? Now, psychological safety, you've probably read literature or heard about this. It's normally described using some quotes from Amy Anderson. It's a shared belief by the team that the team is okay, safe for interpersonal risk-taking, and etc. And it's a team climate that's characterized by trust and mutual respect, where people are comfortable being themselves. Some things that psychological safety isn't, it's not being comfortable. It doesn't mean you don't have any tension. It doesn't mean that everybody likes each other and you hold hands and sing Kumbaya after the retrospective. That's not what it is. It's not harmony in a team. A psychologically safe space is a room of trust that can only be built together by a team. Since this room is not physical, but it's a mental room, you can build it in a virtual environment, but there are a lot of challenges to do that. Now, psychological safety is an aspect of culture. And one thing we know from complexity theory is that culture is a derivative property. It's an emergent property that happens as a result of the self-organization process. Now, being an emergent derivative property means that it's very difficult to directly influence it, which is why a lot of times if you send your management on a training and expect to change your culture by doing that, it's normally never going to work, okay? So psychological safety is based on trust, okay? It's not based on affection. Trust, a number of psychologists have gotten very good definitions of this. Simpson says trust is the intersection of a person's hopes and their fears. And Deutsch says that trust is a confidence that you'll find what you want from somebody rather than what you fear from them. For me, trust is the currency of our interactions. That's what we deal with when we interact with each other. We don't deal in information or emotions. The amount of information we give someone, the amount of emotions or feelings we show someone depends on how much trust we have in that other person. Okay? Trust is like the interest on your bank account. It takes very long to accrue it, but you can blow it very quickly. And also, once you lose it, it's often very difficult, if not impossible, to gain it again. Another thing to remember is that trust can only be given. Trust cannot be taken or demanded. How does trust interact or relate to psychological safety? Trust is a personal attribute. It's dyadic. It's always towards another person. It's contextual and it's dispositional. Okay? I trust you in a certain context to do something, and how much I trust you depends on my personal disposition. Psychological safety as an environmental attribute. Okay? So let's go on. I'd like to ask you a question, and if you can type this into the chat, then it would be very interesting. Think about the last moment when you gave somebody your trust. How did it feel to you trusting somebody? Just write one adjective.
Let me see what comes in here, Joseph.
Okay.
Vulnerable, natural, scary, warm,
Mm-hmm.
scary, another one, uncertain, good, calculated,
Calculated. Interesting.
empowering, good, released, worried, relief,
Mm-hmm.
connected, a few people connected, relieving, worried. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What we see here is that the adjectives we're getting are all over the valence spectrum, from ones that might be termed negative or scared or worried to ones that are very positive. It'd be interesting if we did another question to say, how did you feel after you gave it, and how did you feel before you gave it? But let's just go on. The establishment of trust is a process of reducing uncertainty. Okay? The problem with it is that we humans, we're not used to living alone. We're used to interacting with each other, and part of that interaction is that we tend to become attracted to others. But entering relationships with each other leads us to a dependency on the other, and this dependency leads us to be vulnerable, leads us to be anxiety. So what we have is we have an ambivalence between attraction and anxiety. And because of this ambivalence, what we tend to do is try to evaluate the other person's behavior in order to reduce the uncertainty. Trust is this reduction of uncertainty. A typical way that we do this is with something that we call a strain test. The simplest way, example for a strain test is, oh, could you do me a favor? If I ask you to do me a favor, especially if the favor is something that you normally might not do, but you do it as a favor to me, then I might question your motivation, you might question my motivation, but if I see you doing this, I can start trusting you. An interesting aspect about this, something you shouldn't forget in terms of team building, is that the more rules you have, the more norms you have, the more you stifle building trust. The reason is that the more rules you have, the more norms you have, the more difficult it is to gauge whether that other person's reaction is done genuinely because of trust, or they're just doing it because it's expected or it's required according to the situation and the rules. Okay? So what makes this more challenging is putting this in a virtual environment. Right? Cognitive dissonance theory, based on Festinger's work, says that individuals try to maintain a consistency between their different cognitions on the phenomenological side. They try to balance their thoughts, their attitudes, and behaviors. When there are inconsistencies, they produce stress, which we then try to reduce. Okay? We might reduce this by doing an action or by changing the way we think. Okay? Or we might just rationalize this in a different way. We have a big challenge here with the cognitive dissonance when we're working in a virtual environment. There's been some recent writing from Giampiero Petriglieri, a psychologist who's a professor at INSEAD, who says, I finally understand why everybody's so exhausted after video calls. It's the plausible deniability of each other's absence. We can't ignore the fact that we're not together. Right? Our minds are tricked into the idea of being together when our bodies feel and know that we're not. This is a cognitive dissonance. It's easier being in each other's presence or in each other's absence rather than being in the constant presence of each other's absence. Okay? Our bodies process so much context, so much information in our encounters that meeting on video it's a weird way of like being blindfolded. We sense too little, but we don't have enough to be able to imagine. And that single deprivation, that requires a lot of conscious effort in order to deal with it. Right? Now, this effort applies to multiple levels of awareness. As Merleau-Ponty once wrote, he said, I look at him. He sees that I look at him, and I see that he sees that I look at him, and he sees that I see that he sees that I look at him. So slowly, there are no longer two separate consciousnesses, but two mutually enfolding glances. Okay? So for him, these type of experiences, they're part of what we call an embodied reversibility. I see, hear, and I experience you the way you see, hear, and experience me. So where are the challenges here? Some specific challenges, according to Friesen, is that you're lacking eye contact. It's like you're talking to somebody who's constantly looking at their mobile phone. They're not looking at you, right? Right? In eye contact, you not only observe the other person's eyes, you see them attending to your attention as you attend to their attention. Okay? Secondly, is looking awry, right? Even if you're not on, you're on screen, and people are seeing something different about you than you might be seeing about yourself. And often, if you're picking your nose or something like that, sometimes you forget that everybody sees that. And by the way, I just did that on purpose to show you. Okay. The other thing is that you feel watched. You can feel observed. Without this overt eye contact, this embodied reciprocity, sometimes you feel that you're being scrutinized and observed by some anonymous people, right? Though we might pretend to be looking at each other on FaceTime or on Zoom, we're really just looking at ourselves. We're moving around to see our best position here, exercising our face expressions, and trying to find the most flattering angle so that we look better. Right? The fourth problem is voices, is audio. Face-to-face, we're able to monitor our speaking as a result of our vocal projection, as a result of the acoustics around us. And we do this based on the assumption of acoustic reversibility, that others hear the world the way we do. Of course, this isn't necessarily the case. Our mic might be muted. Sound is undirected, the way vision is directed. I remember when I started doing these webinars and stuff at the beginning of April, I used to come out with a sore throat after a half an hour because I was shouting, because I wasn't aware that I could just talk in a normal volume because I didn't have that personal contact with people. So, interesting quote from Jaron Lanier, one of the inventors of virtual reality, says that human interaction has both verbal and nonverbal elements. Video conferencing seems precisely configured to confound the nonverbal ones. Okay, so if we have this problem, what kind of solutions do we have? Petrolieri posted a quote recently. He said that, look, social media, that was just practice. All the stuff we did on Facebook and Twitter and whatever, that's just practice. This now is the real game. It's not that we're just learning these new tools. We have to learn how to be with, how to interact with each other, or we lose. And since being is an existential game, what we lose are ourselves, if not our lives. Okay? This goes back to the old quote attributed to Darwin, right? It's not the most intellectual of the species, it's not the strongest, it's the species that's most able to adapt and adjust to the changing environment that it finds itself in, right? Despite the odd ways that communication takes place in video conference or in society, we have to get accustomed to this way of communication. This talk isn't about 10 tips on how to make your Zoom conference better. You can find a lot of that on the web someplace, but there are a couple of things that you might know already, right? Place your camera at eye level. What I prefer to do is sit further back from the camera so that the parallax between what I'm looking at the screen and what the camera is reduced, so it actually looks like I'm looking at you, right? And alternative is just don't use video conferencing. Just don't use video conferencing. Because no matter what we do to have a smooth video conferencing, we'll always lack this mutually enfolding that Merleau-Ponty says, right? This is a mutual enfolding that only happens when we meet each other face to face. Okay? So Petrolieri once again writes, and I agree, I find Zoom easier if I don't look at people. Then I can mimic their distance. I can feel that they're not there, and that feels more real. If I want intimacy and we're apart, I'll phone. If I want to say, I'm thinking of you, I'll write. When I'm traveling, my wife and I normally don't use video conferencing. We'll call each other or we'll write to each other because we find that to be more intimate in our conversations with each other. And if we think back to writing, think about all the great literature that has come from pen pals, from Goethe and Schiller, from Sartre and de Beauvoir, from Einstein and Freud. How much of that exchange happened and could happen just because their mode of communication was writing. And sometimes it is a good idea to think about foregoing the additional bandwidth that video gives you, especially when you're in a dyadic, a one-on-one conversation. Of course, if you're interacting in a group, this is going to be difficult because your loss of visual cues leads to loss in your conversational flow. And any of us who've been on a telephone conference will probably recognize at least a couple of these conference call bingo things, right? Take a look at that. How many of these have you had to deal with in your last telephone conferences? Okay, let's go on. Let's skip over this one quick. That thing. Yeah. So one thing that I like to do, and one thing that's suggested by a number of psychologists, is play trust games. Remember, I talked about these strain tests. There are ways to do that in a game format. There are ways of doing variants of prisoner's dilemma. There are a lot of games that have been researched by people like Woolley and her colleagues in terms of team intelligence and psychological safety. These are things that I'm currently working on with colleagues on developing a set of tools for that. One thing I'd like to mention is that my friend and my colleague Yvonne Roner has been doing a lot of work on designing these types of games and interactions in a virtual space to help teams get back together and find their best way of working after this pandemic is over. I mentioned one of her works. She wrote a retrospective known as Getting Back to Face on a recent LinkedIn post, but you can Google her name or find her on LinkedIn, and she's very approachable and has some really good new ideas about how to deal with this. But for the end, just a couple practical steps of things to do, right? Start measuring, start changing, right? You can only change what you can measure. Okay, you can change anything, but you only know if you're improving if you start measuring. You might want to use things just like the safety check in retrospectives, or you might want to go to Amy Anderson's book and get her questionnaire of her 14 questions. Okay, that way you can find out where's your baseline. Are things improving? Are things getting worse? So that you can measure and figure out what interventions to start doing this. Secondly, you can create awareness. One exercise I like to do is a trust exercise where people can just say, in this context, I feel that I can both be myself when I can do something without you doing something, and you do something. Use this as an exercise in your next team retrospective and find out what people really think. You may have to do this anonymously. If you do this anonymously, what does that tell you about the level of trust and safety in your team, right? So you yourself can be a role model in terms of giving people your trust. You can be a role model in terms of encouraging people's interactions. And last, you can create your own environment. Right? Self-organization results of the interaction of the agents and their environment. The interesting thing is that the environment influences how the agents interact, but the agents can also change their environment. Take a look what you can do to change your environment, your real environment or your virtual environment, to create social petal spaces, create places where people can and like to meet up with each other. So one last question at the end that I'd like to hear from you. On a scale of 1 to 5, we're slowly coming out of this pandemic. We're slowly coming out of the lockdown. How many of you are looking forward to getting things back to normal? And how many of you say that I'm taking advantage of this opportunity to change? Could you write that in the last poll, please?
So Joseph, we already have some responses to that, and I can share some preliminary results with you. 38% say this is the opportunity of a lifetime to change things. 43% say we finally have the chance to change. So combined, this is over 80%. 15% are neutral, and only 5% in total say either 1 or 2. So take me back to the place I was before, or let's go back to business as usual as much as we can.
Okay, I find that very positive. I also find that there's now an echo. There's somebody's microphone on. Okay, it sounds better now. Good. I find this very positive because one thing we have to question is whether that normal that we're going back to is something we really want to go back to, or if that wasn't the cause of a lot of the psychological problems that we have nowadays. Okay. So thanks. This short talk. I'd be interested to hear from you.
Yeah. So Joseph, thank you so much for this great talk. I don't even know where to start with the questions. So let me see what's up there and from the participants. Right mechanism for living through these times and to even learn from these times.
So I'm I you your audio dropped. Could you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, sorry. So, what do you think is the best coping mechanism for living through these times and to even learn from them?
Large quantities of alcohol. No, sorry. Um, one, let's get back to the one quote of mine that you put in. We don't make mistakes, we learn. Our only mistake is not learning from experience and framing everything that's happened as a learning experience and taking advantage of that opportunity. This is where we start taking advantage of opportunities to learn, not being punished. In complex systems, you can't know things in advance. This is what Dave Snowden calls retrospective coherence. A large part of our problems in business is that we're being punished for things that we can't know in advance. Unfortunately, this has led to coping mechanisms which themselves create problems. For example, estimation, right? Estimating in time is not the problem. The political consequences of estimating in time is a problem. If teams keep being nailed by management to time estimates, they're going to find some alternative way just to maneuver around that by using things like story points. That's a coping mechanism. That's a sign that there's a culture based on blame and not on trust. Okay? So, any other questions?
Yes, there are a few other questions. I have a bit of a problem with my sound here, but I will work through that. The
Okay.
next one was from someone asking, there are some companies that use 3D virtual team rooms to collaborate, where you meet as avatars. Do you think that this is better than only 2D virtual collaboration like Zoom?
Uh, Fully immersive virtual reality. Uh, I think that's one of the ways of the future. I'm personally happy that the first commercial environment, Croquet, was written in Smalltalk. Smalltalk lives. I think this is a way into the future. The question is, once again, how immersive are these environments, right? Because if we're dealing with the fact here, as Petrolieri says, we can't avoid realizing that we're not together. A 3D, totally immersive environment will make us even more aware of the fact that we're not together because we won't have the haptics. We won't have that touch and feel. But I think that's definitely a way of the future.
So let me go to the next one. What are signs to look for to determine if you have a trust/communication problem in your team? This is Stefan Hausmann.
Uh, there are scientific diagnostics for that. I don't have any in my brain right now. I think one of the easiest ways is this one safety check from retrospectives, where everybody writes on a piece of paper how comfortable they feel on a scale of 1 to 5. Right? Is a 5 is I'm totally happy speaking about everything. 1 is this I'm going to smile and say everything's okay, but I'm not saying anything. And then whoever is facilitating that collects them and reads them anonymously. Simple measures like that are a lot easier than doing some kind of professional diagnostic. And that's probably where I would start with.
I think that question and your response, Joseph, leads us to the next question actually from Andreas. He says, so do you see good ways of helping people, building more trust? Now, imagine you understand that there is no trust or there is a lack of trust. How would you build more trust if they are really uncertain in trusting people other than themselves? For example, micromanagers building trust in agile team and let them self-organize.
This, I don't know. Quite honest about that. I can't give you an answer right out of the thing. Thinking about micromanagers, what's really disappointed me is, for example, I've heard over the past couple of months from people who said that I'm doing home office, but the boss requires me to have my video on all the time so they can see I'm at my desk working, right? Things like that. So where do you start? I don't have anything canned, commoditized that I can bring out. My personal approach is to go in and actually work with the team and start doing some of this more in-depth analysis and find out where the problems are. What I would then start working on is at a dyadic level, a person-to-person interaction level, because that's where the basis of trust is. Working person to person and finding out which dyads work well together. You could do social network analysis on that and find out who the key players are and bring them then on board. Social network analysis is a very difficult thing to do because of lack of trust and lack of anonymity, but that will tell you very quickly who are the key players, who are the key people that information or power or things flow through. And that would then help as part of one of these diagnostics.
So now that we had talked about the difficulties of being online, and then we even had this question with 3D virtual places where people can meet, one person is asking Stefan again, what are your thoughts on mixed conferences, which means some participants meet on premise and the others via video chat? What are the challenges you see there, or maybe the benefits compared to a pure video chat? Joseph, can you hear me? We lost you somehow. So this looks like, you're back, Joseph. Did you get my question about the hybrid meetings?
Yeah. Okay. I was just checking my ping time to see if I dropped off or where it was. Okay. The problem with virtual conferences is the same problem as with any distributed multi-site development. You have the issue that of what you would in sports call a home advantage, right? Who has the power? Which is the central site, and who are the people who are then the outliers? I think this probably comes down to be the same type of question. How do you deal with that people have the feeling I'm inside or I'm outside? And how do the people who are outside contribute? About the only thing comparable to that we have in a live environment is doing a fishbowl, right? Where only the people in the fishbowl can contribute. But I think we're going to have to find different ways, different techniques to be able to deal with this. And I'm curious to hear if anybody comes up with them.
I think we all are. Now, during your presentation, at the end, you shared those 3 questions or 4, I think, from Amy Edmondson. And there's a bunch of surveys out there, assessments out there where you can analyze to what extent there is trust within a team and this concept of psychological safety. Now, Kim is asking, what is the quickest lightweight test or observation you have experienced that reliably tells you there's a low trust environment? I mean, this is one of the questions that we as consultants always get asked, but maybe you actually have an answer for it.
So the challenge here, something's dropping again.
I can hear you, Joseph.
Okay. The challenge is which tools do you have available? All right. And yes, this is the advantage I have as a psychologist, is I have access to other tools than you do. Also, I have access to other training, years of training in analyzing this stuff. What I'm working on right now with a colleague is actually putting together a package of some of these tools that we can provide to others uh, who aren't psychologists to be able to use and hopefully not abuse in order to help with them. And I'll be posting more on that probably in a couple months once we figure out actually how to do this.
I think you mentioned an important point, which is not only the tools that you're accessible to, but also the training that you have in order to actually make some meaning out of the data or the insights that you get. I remember that from my time as a medical doctor, we had like patients coming in and already diagnosing themselves based on the Google searches. And one of the doctors that I worked with, in his waiting room, he had a poster on the wall stating, "Your Google research does not equal my medical degree." And I think this is always important to remember that, especially also in a field like psychology, it's not only about the assessment, it's also about the ability to deal or to analyze that assessment. So keeping that in mind, I think is worth it. Now,
Yes.
let's move on to another question from Peter. I remember Peter from working with him on several clients. Now, is there research that confirms or denies that alternating physical/virtual meetings contributes to the effectiveness of these meetings? I tend to observe it builds up different types of resilience, but that may be personal. That's Peter's question for you, Joseph.
I am not aware of any research, but all that means is that I'm not aware of any research. Okay? I'm aware of a lot of research, and by the way, I will put together the slide deck for distribution, and this slide deck will have a couple pages of all the research resources and everything in it so that you can read what I've based this talk on. Okay? But actually, right now, I'm not aware of any research done on that. It's something that I would have to look into.
Perfect. All right. I'm looking forward to the attachment to the presentation, basically. Now, there's
some research on the fact that standing up meetings are more efficient than sitting down meetings. There's actually a couple papers out on that. So, but I think that's something that we've all experienced live every morning when we do a stand-up, if we're doing Scrum or something. Yeah.
Cool. I would also like that research, because I get to ask that question a lot from people in my classes. Why is it called a daily stand-up or a daily Scrum? I'm like, yeah, there's more oxygen and all of that, but having that research available makes it, I think, really good. Now, York is asking, I see that in the online/remote world, you can blow trust very easy and quick, but people less look for the bilateral conversation. What I do is a lot of shuttle mediation before I bring them together. Do you think there's a better way?
Could you repeat the beginning of that question again?
Yeah. So York observes or sees that in the online and remote world, you can blow trust very easy and quickly. But people less look for the bilateral conversation, right? We all see that on Twitter, etc. What he does is a lot of shuttle mediation before he brings people together. Do you think there's a better way?
Once again, I find that establishing certain rules of engagement is probably good, although, once again, this has the issue regarding trust, that you don't know if a person is actually doing something because of trusting or because they're just obeying the rules of engagement. But it's a good way to start, and then have people design their own rules of engagement. Something like team chartering, or the rules that we might do when we start doing a training, our rules of conduct. I've done a lot of team charters with teams starting projects where essentially one of the biggest parts is their code of conduct. So channeling that conversation, structuring that conversation is probably a good way. Another thing that I still think is very good is have people do training in emotional intelligence. Part of emotional intelligence is also understanding and being able to read and understand other people and their feelings, and then learn how to deal with that. Also learning how to understand your own feelings and how to deal with them.
Mhm. So we have a lot of questions around this topic of being virtual. Now, this corona crisis puts us all into this challenge of being virtual. And maybe you were similar to me before this pandemic, when companies, clients, people in in my classes asked me whether teams should be on premise, like in the same place. My answer would always be yes. And I actually wanted to have more and more organization embrace that, having teams in one place, ideally in one room. Now, I think it's inevitable, and that's my hypothesis, going into the future, even post-corona, that more and more teams will be distributed across the globe, and not only have the challenge of not being in the same room, but also have the challenge of not necessarily speaking the same language. And even if they speak English, independent from the accents, having a different cultural background results in different understanding of many, many things. What would be some tips that you can share, like bridging that differences in culture? Maybe you have experience in that. You're one of the elder statesmen in our Agile and Scrum community, so I'm using this opportunity to pick your brain on that.
Yeah, I think what we should do is do some more research and actually quantify what the overhead is, what the load or drag factor is of these of not being able to communicate directly face to face. You know, I've done some of my PhD research on similar topics, but nothing that could be that directly applied to this. Um, but there is an additional overhead, and remember, culture has a jet lag, right? Uh, and these are the things that we're going to have to deal with. Accepting the fact that we are going in this direction, we should quantify what the additional overhead is, where that overhead comes from, and what we can do to mitigate these additional problems. And one of them is, doing as much bandwidth as possible. The other is training people in cultural diversity, training people more in emotional intelligence to learn better how to interact with each other. That's just a gut feeling of mine.
No, I agree. I think there's a lot of the things I've been thinking myself in that space. Now, one of the challenges that I've observed in the past 3 months, it's been right here in Germany at least a bit more, is that many organizations moved to remote, but tried to do everything that they do normally in a remote. There are some organizations that have worked purely remote for many, many years. One of those companies is Basecamp, and I'm sure some of you have read their books. One of them is actually called Remote, and they always emphasize on the fact that you should not work in the same way remotely as you would do on site, and try to get some of the benefits that only a remote way of working can offer you. Now, have you had similar experiences, Joseph, about the transition that organizations made? And what kind of tips and tricks would you give to them when it's about staying remote in the long run and still having effective teams, effective employees, effective leaders, and all of that?
Yeah. So Rob, I've probably had the same experiences you had as a trainer, going in and thinking I could do my first virtual training exactly the same way with the same timings and the same breaks and everything as I did it live. And that crashed and burned relatively quickly, right? Uh, and it's the same thing with organizations. Your interaction is different, and you have to accept that and figure out the best way to do it. And one one person that's really helped there is the lady I mentioned before, Yvonne Rohner, whose specialty is actually virtual interaction, and who's very good. She's helped me redesign webinars and trainings and things that I've done, because the interaction is totally different. So yeah, I think the first thing to do is understand, as you said, things are not going to be the same. You have to approach them totally different.
All right. Joseph, thank you so much for taking the time, putting this presentation together, giving the talk today, going with me through the Q&A. Really appreciate your effort. Looking forward to further conversations in the future. Have a great weekend, and I hope you stick around at the conference and maybe can respond to some of the questions people have through the chat. Thank you,
Okay.
Joseph.
I'll try to stay online. Stay healthy. Thanks a lot.
You too. Bye, Joseph.
Bye-bye.